Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and this next video is going to be a continuation of my College Football First series, but I'm going to be going out of the country for these next few episodes. The reason for that is I'll be covering some of the first international games in college football history. I'll be covering the first college football games in Cuba, Japan, a tour around Europe, and a game that was scheduled in the Soviet Union. But before I start on this international journey, make sure that you subscribe to the channel below. Also, make sure you ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos that will be dropping throughout the rest of the year. Of course, like and share this video with other college football fans, and you can check out my Patreon, my podcast, and my social media in the description below. So for this episode of College Football First, I'm going to be going to Cuba just after the turn of the century for an interesting game that would also become an early test for a postseason bowl game. So to start, I'm going to have to go back to 1907. This was a time in college football where a lot of changes were happening, mostly on the field. First was the forward pass, which was now legalized, but it was used sparingly due to incomplete passes resulting in a penalty that would send you back 15 yards. So it wasn't used as often just yet. This was also the first season where a touchdown was worth more than a field goal, as touchdowns were now worth 5 points and field goals were worth 4. There were also other rules that helped to make college football more uniformed and safer all over the country after dozens of deaths and serious injuries happened in the first 30 years of the sport. But to go along with changes that were happening in the sport, there were also changes that were happening just 90 miles off the coast of America, as Cuba is now just starting to be an independent country. With the end of the Spanish-American War, Cuba would gain their independence from Spanish colonial rule, but that would bring a lot of fighting too between different political forces that tried to take control of the island. Due to that, American troops would be stationed in the country over the next decade plus and brought some new American customs and sports to the island. One of the sports U.S. troops brought over was the new game of American football. The sport was mostly played by sailors and soldiers that lived on the ports there, but some of the upper echelon of society in Cuba also played, which helped with relations between Cubans and Americans. Along with this, Cubans started to get really good and wanted to test themselves against other teams, not just servicemen. So they sent out invites to American schools to play them. One of those schools to get an invite was LSU. LSU was only in their 15th year of playing, but after a 6-3 season and being one of the more exciting teams in the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association, they accepted the invite from the University of Havana. LSU's coach at this time was first-year head coach Edgar R. Wingard, and he accepted this invite because he saw it as a great chance for his team to get more practice, to gain more game experience, and also to make history as the first North American college squad to play in Cuba. But along with those enticing things, there was also another motivation. That motivation was spreading the name of LSU to not only Latin American students and athletes, but spreading the name of LSU all over the continent. That was because the game would get a lot of promotion all over Cuba, but also all over America, helping to raise the profile of LSU in the future. This kinda sounds a lot like what fans and administrators will say about sports in colleges now and how they help the college, even though it's really a real moneymaker now than it was a promotional game back then. But the game was now set for Christmas Day 1907, and LSU would send a delegation of 13 players, their coach, the team manager, and a bevy of student rooters and supporters. They would take a train from Baton Rouge to New Orleans on December 21st, and then board a ship to set sail for Havana. The trip wasn't a great one though, and due to rough seas and some seasickness on the trip, it would take 3 days, but they would arrive in Havana early on Christmas Eve. When the team and the supporters got there, they were greeted by hundreds of servicemen and sailors, as well as a small Cuban contingent, mostly from the upper echelon and from the University of Havana. The LSU team wouldn't get a look at their opponent until game time, but heard from newspapers that the Havana team were quite large, as they outweighed the LSU Tigers by 34 pounds per player. Along with that, the University of Havana team did also have some experience, as the year before, the club would play a team of U.S. naval officers and put up a valiant fight in a tough loss. So many thought that due to their size and experience, this should be a good game. The game would be taking place in the afternoon at Almendras Park, in front of what was reported as 4,200 people. Some were fans of the University of Havana, but most sided with the LSU team. One of the biggest reasons for that was there was 2 large U.S. gunboats anchored in the harbor, which sent a large delegation of sailors and officials as well as groups of servicemen from nearby Camp Columbia to be in the stands and throw their hats after every LSU touchdown. And the sailors would have to throw their hats a lot, as LSU dominated University of Havana 56-0 with big touchdown runs averaging 30 yards or better. The win would give LSU their 7th win of the season, even though the game was technically an exhibition, but they did count it on their record. But it did give LSU 7 wins for the first time as well. After that successful 1907 game, the game would come back to the same stadium in 1909, except LSU was not there. There was another team, though, from Louisiana that would play, and that was Tulane. I don't have a lot of information on this game, nor do I really have many pictures, but it was significant due to the outcome of the game. First off, Tulane came down just before New Year's Day with a 3-3-2 team, so they weren't as good as the LSU team that came there in 1907. Also, their opponent wouldn't be the same as the 1907 Cuban team either, as this time they were opposed by a team made up of players from the Cuban Athletic Club. The game would also be a one-sided affair too, but in the other direction, as Tulane couldn't do anything and they were shut out 11-0, giving Cuba their first win over an American team in American football. The win helped to further the game on the island and lead to this exhibition postgame to continue, as it would in 1911, and have Mississippi A&M, or Mississippi State as they are called now, come down to easily win over the Cuban Athletic Club, getting some retribution for that American game 2 years ago. But the story of American football in Cuba got a little more interesting and kind of weird in 1912 with the arrival of the Florida Gators. They were set up to play 2 games around Christmas against 2 different teams and under different rules, but I'll get to that in just a moment. The 2 teams were the Cuban Athletic Club and a team from a local tennis club. The first game against the local tennis club went off without a hitch, as Florida dominated 28-0. But the second game, which pitted the Gators against the Cuban Athletic Club of Havana a few days later, was never finished. The reason for that was because Florida head coach George E. Pyle stopped it. That was because the coach realized during the first quarter that the game was being officiated using college football's pre-1906 rules. Now, I'm not really sure what set him off in the game, but I have found that he started to get what was happening after he saw that one of the officials for this game played on the team that Florida beat 3 days previous, and Pyle would take his team off the field after he noticed that, which resulted in him being arrested for violating a Cuban law which prohibited a game from ending prematurely after money had been collected already. Due to that, Pyle would be taken to jail, but only for a few hours, during which a trial was scheduled, but he would manage to make bail and quickly left the island with the Gators team, never to return. That was because if he did return, he would be branded as a fugitive from justice and probably be arrested by Cuban authorities. After that crazy game, there wouldn't be another American football game, at least with a college team versus a Cuban team, until 1915, when the small Florida Southern College came down to play them, and they would come down every few years until the 1930s. Rollins College and Florida would also play a few times in Cuba through the 1910s and 1920s, including a 3-game series in 1923. But the next big college that would come down would be Ole Miss, as they would come down to Cuba in 1921 and lost in their only trip down there. But Ole Miss was 3-5 coming into the game, and with no other Southern team accepting the invitation, Ole Miss took the invite instead. One more team of note that did come down to Cuba was Miami, as they played versus the University of Havana in back-to-back games in 1925 and 1928, but after that point it was mostly small Southern schools. But even with all of these smaller exhibition games happening, the biggest test for Cuban football games would be the 1936 version of the game. It would be the first time that 2 American schools would come down to play a licensed bowl game in another country. The 2 teams were Auburn and Villanova. They were both at 7-2 at the time and meeting on January 1st, 1937. The game wouldn't get a lot of press because of the turmoil in the government in Cuba over the last few years, but it did get some press in America, and since this was an actual licensed game, it would actually count towards either one of these 2 colleges' records. But apparently the game almost didn't happen after the programs didn't have a picture of Batista, the new military dictator in Cuba at this point. After a new program was done and more pictures of Batista were hanging around the stadium, the game would go on. The game was a hard-fought one, and a low-scoring affair unlike the other games, and it ended in a 7-7 tie. But even though that game was a good one, it turned out to be the swan song of this post-game experiment for the NCAA. There would be other games that happened in the years after, but mostly between smaller colleges and the University of Havana. Along with that, the University of Havana would come to America to play some colleges like I mentioned before, Rollins, the University of Tampa, and they even played a freshman team of Alabama in 1946. But none of these games got nearly the amount of media coverage as the older games, if really any coverage at all. The final game in Cuba that I can find record of happened in 1950 between a team made up of sailors from the Jacksonville, Florida Naval Station and the University of Havana. Meanwhile, the final football game of record played by Cuban athletes was in 1956, as players from the University of Havana traveled the 90 miles north to Key West, Florida to play Stetson University and lose 56-0. But with Fidel Castro now taking power towards the end of the 1950s, he wanted to get rid of anything that was elitist and American, and football was on the chopping block, since most of the athletes playing were from universities or the elites, and this game was introduced by Americans. Castro had basically forbade the sport from being played on the island and instead pushed baseball and boxing onto the people. With football basically being illegal, there are no more records of football games happening in Cuba or by Cubans past 1956, and that is where it would end. And since so much time has passed, I'm pretty sure they'll never play it again unless we reintroduce it to the country. But thank you so much for coming on this journey with me to Cuba as I talk about the first college football games that happened in Cuba. I will have more international videos coming up in the weeks ahead, so make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below and ring the bell so you get updates on when those videos will be dropping. Of course, like and share this video with other college football fans, and check out a brand new podcast that I have. You can also help me out on my Patreon and check out my social media in the description below. Have a fantastic rest of your day.